Hello, my name is Brendan Anderson from the blog Here's Looking at You Kid, and today is part 4 of my look at classic horror films. And the two films that I've selected to review today are House of Wax 3D and The Curse of Frankenstein. Let's get right to it. House of Wax 3D was one of the first ever major studio 3D productions made, when it was made back in 1953. It was shot in what was called natural vision 3D, which meant that when it was projected, it used two projectors to create that 3D effect. Today we just use digital to create the 3D effect, and we don't need two projectors. House of Wax was also hailed recently by Martin Scorsese as being the greatest 3D movie of all time. So needless to say, my expectations were a bit high when I was looking at this new 3D Blu-ray release. The first time ever on home video you'd be able to experience House of Wax as it was originally intended. Well, actually, I was not disappointed at all. House of Wax 3D is a fun, chilling ride that you definitely want to take, and it's a perfect treat for Halloween. Now, my review of the film is probably bumped up a little bit because I did get to see it in 3D, but even if you saw this in 2D, the performance by Vincent Price in this film and the overall story really would work. It just adds that extra bit of depth, no pun intended, to see it in 3D. And really, this was an expertly done 3D production. Not only does it have the pop-out effect, but the objects are placed in the room just perfectly so that you really feel the space of everything, and things feel real and in their proper place. And not only is depth enhanced, but they also were not afraid to add some pop-out effects that would actually make you sort of jolt back in your seat. So it's a great rollicking 3D ride, but as a movie itself, it's still pretty good. Vincent Price plays a insane curator of a wax museum. Well, he's not really insane, he just has a great appreciation for beauty and his creations. And, well, after that wax museum gets burned down and he's presumed dead, well, strange things start happening to the owner of the museum, who burned it down for the insurance money. So you can kind of get where this plot's going, but it's still a really fun ride, and I'm not going to give away any more than that because there are still plenty of surprises the movie has up its sleeve. Really, overall, all I can say about this movie is, as a major studio horror film, it works really well. It's shot in Technicolor, which would make you think that it wouldn't be as scary, but it is still very, there's some chilling and suspenseful moments, and in 3D, there's some great pop-out moments there. So I would highly recommend seeing this in 3D. If you saw it in 3D, I'd give it a 4.5 out of 5. In 2D, just the film itself, I'd give a solid 4 out of 5. It's a really, really good horror film. Alright, so The Curse of Frankenstein was made in 1957, and The Curse of Frankenstein is important because it's the first of the Hammer horror films. Hammer Horror was a Hammer Studios was a British production company, and they made mostly B-movies. But it wasn't until The Curse of Frankenstein that they ended up making what they would become famous for, and that was their horror films. And Hammer Horror probably has had a great influence on modern horror, because while people like Val Lewton were more subtle in their horror, Hammer Horror was not about subtlety. It's all about practically showing everything, with a little bit more sex and a lot more violence than had been in horror movies previously. Part of the reason they could do this is because in the 1950s the production code let up a lot, so Hammer was able to have a little more risque situations in their films and a lot more blood than you usually saw in a horror film for that time. And Curse of Frankenstein definitely has both of those. I mean, it's still tame by today's standards in both categories, but compared to something like The Mummy from 1932, it's a heck of a lot less subtle, and even less subtle than any of the Universal films. This Frankenstein movie is really hard to watch without comparing it to the original from 1931, and in the end, because of that comparison, it doesn't quite meet up with the original, or exceed it in any way. The only way I could say that this Frankenstein really exceeds or comes close to the original is that Peter Cushing does a fantastic job at playing Dr. Frankenstein. And in this film, Dr. Frankenstein is not sort of the good guy that Colin Clive's guy was in the 1931 version. he's a bad guy in this film, and he's manipulative, and even, well, I won't spoil it. But yes, he's a bad dude in this film, and his obsession really drives him, and it's really interesting to see. Christopher Lee as the monster is really hard to look at. Part of it is, well, I mean, his makeup is kind of cool in that Hammer sense of it's not subtle, it's a lot creepier. It looks more like someone put together from cadavers. But, you know, you can't help but compare it to the iconic makeup. Also, Christopher Lee, I don't think, really gets enough screen time as the monster to really have any sort of a performance. He's really just sort of an animal, you know, and so he's fine in his role, but there's nothing there that's really all that special. The film more focuses on Dr. Frankenstein creating the monster, not what the monster actually does. And, you know, Karloff's performance as Frankenstein is actually one of the great performances of all of Hollywood, so I don't think that Christopher Lee quite lives up to that. But he does do an admirable job considering the screen time. But most of that's due to sort of his creepy makeup and everything. Overall, this film is fun, too, and like I said, it's not subtle, and sometimes it's almost over-dramatic, and it's over-serious with itself, but it's still a good movie, and it definitely has had a lot of influence on horror films to this day, because it had a lot more blood, and it showed a lot more stuff that you didn't see, say, in the Universal films. And I think that Hammer's best series of films were the Dracula series, and that would come after this, and Christopher Lee was very good as the Count. So Hammer really took the reins from Universal and showed what it meant to come into the new era. So I think that both of these films from the 50s really showcase horror really coming into its own as it's changing into the modern era. And by the time Psycho hits in 1960, we're almost in full-blown modern horror films. And Hammer became the modern monster house. Not Universal, but Hammer became the modern sort of house of horrors. And then, of course, we'd have more of the slasher films that would come up in the 80s. And speaking of more modern horror films, tune in next time, the day after Halloween. I'll have my review up for my last part of this series, part 5, and it's going to be of Stanley Kubrick's The Shining. So definitely come on November 1st to YouTube and check that out. Until then, if you haven't seen any of the other videos, definitely check them out, as well as subscribe to my channel and click the link below to go see the blog and see other reviews. There are a lot of modern film reviews up there as well, like Gravity and Captain Phillips. So until then, signing off.